A former PM is back in the headlines this week, proving there still must be something in the Blair.
The leaders of the Arab world and Israel and everybody involved asked me to do this, so it would be headed by a gentleman known as President Donald J. Trump of the United States. That's what I want, is some extra work to do, but it's so important that I'm willing to do it, and we'll do it right, and we're going to put leaders from other countries on, and leaders that are very distinguished leaders, and we'll have a board, and one of the people that wants to be on the board is the UK former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Good man, very good man. And
President Trump announcing his proposed Board of Peace on Monday. Not exactly under the radar news, Arion, but the familiar name cropping up there is what you would like to focus on this week.
Yeah, this week we've seen a fascinating and rather unexpected re-emergence of Tony Blair, and 3 stories have come together around him. The main one is the one that we were just hearing about, is that he appears to be being lined up a role in post-war Gaza, and there's lots of speculation about what exactly that role might be and what he'd do with it. But that isn't his only comeback. His digital IDs are back on the national agenda 20-odd years after he first proposed them. But the third, and perhaps most interesting and under-the-radar story around him, is that there's been a bunch of articles stemming from reporting done by a couple of investigative newsrooms about the Tony Blair Institute and how it's championing AI, in part, potentially because billionaire Larry Ellison of Oracle fame has given him loads of cash. So it's a lot to dig into. I'm sure we'll break it into pieces, but it sort of amounts to this second coming of a man who's sort of never been entirely comfortable being relegated to the political wilderness.
Well, exactly. He's sort of never really been away. And I suppose cynical listeners will be saying, Arion, you just haven't been paying attention if you're surprised by this news. As you say, he has the Tony Blair Institute. The whole purpose of that is to wangle its way into the kind of decisions that governments are making. He's previously been a Middle East envoy, so we knew about that. He has championed, as you say, I mean, to be fair, they weren't digital IDs originally, were they? Under him, they were ID cards, but he's championed that idea for 20 years. So not a surprise. It's just that that's the way the news agenda's gone this week, that his name comes up a lot.
Yes, I suppose so, but it's wild to think that Tony Blair will be in charge of, something like a state in the Middle East where he is entirely persona non grata, except if you're the UN setting him up as a peace envoy of all things. I mean, it's for so long obviously been an intensely controversial thing, but the idea that he'd actually go ahead, as it looks as though Donald Trump was implying, and be the person who's in charge of, yes, a transitional government in Gaza, or at least a body running the place, is astonishing in its own right. But then you add on top of it this whole story about his institute's engagement with the man who was briefly the world's richest man, and I think you've got controversy upon controversy layering up.
I don't know. I mean, Oasis came back, Harriet. Why not Tony Blair?
Well, the truth is, unlike Oasis, Tony Blair's never been unimportant. I think that there's so many strands of the story. So I think just to break it down a little bit, first of all, the Tony Blair Institute is pretty much one of the most powerful and wealthy think tanks in the UK, with astonishing levels of influence and connection and relationships with the current government. And there's also a significant amount of US money that goes into it as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Tony Blair Institute has actually been involved with these plans with Donald Trump and the White House for Gaza for a while now. So Tony Blair he met Trump and Trump's former Middle East envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, for a policy meeting in August. And most embarrassingly, I think this has actually gone quite under the radar, but the FT's done a lot of reporting on this. In the summer, the Tony Blair Institute participated in a project that was led by Israeli businessmen to develop a post-war Gaza plan. And they used financing models created by employees at Boston Consulting Group, which is a big consultancy. And one of the documents, which was reportedly written by a Tony Blair Institute staff member, kind of envisaged kickstarting Gaza's economy with artificial islands off the coast akin to those in Dubai. Now, the Tony Blair Institute later said that its staff had never authored or developed or endorsed any proposal that would involve the relocation or effectively the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. But it was a huge embarrassment for BCG, like an absolutely enormous embarrassment and enormous scandal involving the Tony Blair Institute. So there's that as well. And then the third strand, I think, of this story, which we'll talk about later, is the big, very deep, very intense connections between the Tony Blair Institute and Larry Ellison, briefly the richest man in the world.
Okay. But Felicity, he was, in his pomp, the most popular prime minister of our lifetime. He won a record 3 elections for Labour. It's not surprising for him to have a post-PM career and to have some influence. You'd expect that, wouldn't you?
I would actually. He's a divisive figure. Let's put it that way. I think the problem with Tony Blair really is that he sort of became a villain after Iraq, and a lot of the good stuff that he did when he was in power was just immediately forgotten about, basically because of Iraq and the whole, the Chilcot inquiry, and everyone remember the citizen's arrest when some randomo tried to arrest him, and he just became overnight public enemy number one. But he also did a lot of good things, and when he was in power, the Good Friday Agreement went through, and there are some similarities between what happened in Northern Ireland and the peace process and what they want to achieve in Gaza, particularly because it's to do with armed militants, and how you get them to lay down their weapons. He has unparalleled network in the Middle East that we've talked about. He has a long experience of dealing with both Israeli and Palestinian leaderships. He 7 years as the envoy of the Quartet, which was the diplomatic group of the US, the UN, the EU and Russia, and that was trying to advance the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I mean, you have to give him credit for even wading into this awful, horrendous conflict in some ways. Why would you want to? So, yes, I do think he has become this villain. I actually think he is a very wily, canny operator and negotiator and diplomat, and I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that he's involved. What I would say is that Larry Ellison is very pro-Israel. He is quite close to the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, which I don't love, has donated heavily to the Israeli military through the non-profit Friends of the Israel Defense Forces. In 2017, he gave that organization the biggest ever donation of $16.6 million. So that is possibly a bit icky, but it remains to be seen. And look where we are with Gaza right now. It's a complete disaster. It's awful. It's horrific. Let's hope something good can come of his involvement.
Okay, so you've all hinted at the Larry Ellison thing. Let's go there then, Arion. Just for people who don't know really who Larry Ellison is, you may have heard his name, as Harriet said, he's briefly the richest person in the world. Again, was replaced by Elon Musk, who he replaced. But I think a lot of listeners don't really know much about him and his company.
Yes. So Larry Ellison is the founder of Oracle, which has fingers in an enormous amount of pies. And as Harriet says, is one of the biggest tech companies and increasingly powerful due to the fact that it runs and operates lots of data centers all over the world. And those data centers have been the sort of underpinning for a lot of its software, but also he is championing AI and the growth of AI, and so, as it turns out, is the Tony Blair Institute. And so since 2021, this is where it starts to get murky. The Ellison's foundation has pledged at least £257 million to the Tony Blair Institute, and that, again, as Harriet was saying, dwarfs the resources of most UK think tanks. So it's an enormous contribution. And this funding has really kind of transformed the Institute into this global behemoth with 900 staff in 45 countries, raising questions about whether Ellison's commercial interests, his own personal interests, are now being what the Tony Blair Institute is pushing, because the Tony Blair Institute has a lot to say about the importance of AI to governments around the world. And look, that may also be his personal belief, but those two things being tied together has become incredibly murky. And I think the latest round of reporting shows that there's at least discomfort surrounding his engagement with this organization, if not some sort of out-and-out concerning coming together of those two organizations' interests.
Yeah, and I suppose the Venn diagram of concern, Harriet, is around the NHS, isn't it? That's an area that obviously Tony Blair understands well, having been Prime Minister of this country. It's also a massive data set that if you're a technology company, you'd want to get your hands on.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that the big prize, the big thing that the Tony Blair Institute and Tony Blair and Larry Ellison and Oracle all are eyeing, the big prize is access to our most valuable data, which is our NHS health data sets, which is unique around the world. So the US and the EU, they don't have comparable health data sets. Like the NHS records go back for 70 odd years, and the potential commercial value of that data has been estimated to be up to £10 billion per year. So obviously there are huge commercial interests at stake into who gets access to Britain's most valuable data. And it's no coincidence that what Ellison and the Tony Blair Institute have both been banging on about over the last few years is data. And, the Tony Blair Institute published a report recently called Governing in the Age of AI, Building Britain's National Data Library. So they're basically saying that the UK's data infrastructure is fragmented and unfit for purpose. And so why don't we have something like, for example, Oracle come in and take a look and, take control of it? So the Tony Blair Institute is basically suggesting building new digital health records with a system that's run by Oracle, because it doesn't like the fact that the system is run by Palantir, which is a rival of Oracle.
As discussed on a previous episode.
But I think the bigger picture here, if we zoom out a bit, is this very intense personal and financial connection between Larry Ellison and Tony Blair that goes back more than 20 years. And it's not just the connections between Oracle and the Tony Blair Institute, which many previous employees of the Tony Blair Institute have said they're really worried about and they've left because the two organizations are kind of starting to look as though they have merged in very murky ways. But also the personal relationship between these two men, like they've been on holiday together. And then the relationship between Larry Ellison and Donald Trump, and the overall look at interest in data and the commercialization of data and AI boosterism as well. So there's so much money and there's so much data that's kind of up for grabs here. And the political influence and this network, this broader network of where politics and big tech have really started to coincide, makes this a story that has implications for not just all our lives here in the UK, but kind of everyone's lives around the world. It's also, I think, worth keeping an eye on the wider Ellison family as well, because Oracle is part of a group that is hoping to buy TikTok's US operations, and it's also financed Larry Ellison's son, his takeover of Paramount Studios, and the family's now targeting Warner Brothers. And if that goes ahead, and if the sale of the TikTok's US operations go ahead, that would leave the Ellison family in charge of TikTok, Paramount, and if the Warner Brothers sale goes ahead as well, also entertainment and news brands like CBS News and CNN. So this is basically, we're talking about the possibility of one family owning and controlling basically the majority of the US information ecosphere.
Okay, but within the Tony Blair Institute, though, Arion, there are lots of ex-civil servants, there are lots of people who have worked for charities and other think tanks. There are people who would say they themselves are not motivated by any of the stuff that Harriet's just outlined. They're there to try and do something good.
Absolutely. And we're talking about kind of these murky comings together of vast organizations and individuals. And we're talking about that partly because we're not the first people to be talking about that. There's been lots of reporting about this, to which accusations the Tony Blair Institute has responded in response to a query from the New Statesman. And they said, the Tony Blair Institute and Oracle are two separate entities. We collaborate with Oracle to help the work we do in supporting some of the poorest countries in the world, and we're very proud of this. TBI does not advocate for Oracle's commercial interests, nor does it advocate for any tech provider. So they have actually responded to some of these allegations, and I think it's worth including that in this piece.
And Felicity, I mean, regardless of whether we see Tony Blair as, Jesus or James Bond villain, someone is going to come along, aren't they, and take the NHS data and turn it into something that actually could be good for the whole world's health. That's the whole point. I mean, yes, you can monetize it, but you can monetize it because it means better drugs, better outcomes for people.
That's the hope. That's the hope. And I mean, that's certainly similar to, the digital ID cards, that there are going to be ways of revolutionizing our healthcare and our information. And obviously there's fears over civil liberties and, who's getting their hands on our data and our personal information. But I mean, it's no secret to say that Tony Blair is an evangelical proponent of AI, as is his son, Ewan Blair, interestingly, who is co-founder and chief exec of Multiverse, which is a tech startup, and he is worth £375 million. So it runs in the family. He's a big fan of AI, and yeah, I mean, you're right. If it wasn't this, it would be someone else who would get their mitts on the data, I'm sure.